If you enjoyed learning about this pivotal moment in American history, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue bringing you these untold stories that shaped our nation. The alliance between France and the United States awakened across Europe a powerful hope. The hope of overthrowing the old colonial system of commercial monopoly that had strangled nations for generations. American independence was not won by force of arms alone. It was won in part by the sympathies of neutral princes and nations who watched with keen interest as a new republic fought for its life against the mightiest empire on earth. Both great powers found themselves tangled in their own contradictions. The British government, in its attempt to suppress English rights in the colonies by English arms, was making war on the very essence of what made Britain great. The party of freedom and justice, which belongs to all mankind, was revealed to be one and the same for the entire English race. It became increasingly clear to thinking men that if America could be totally subjugated, the repression of liberty in the British Isles themselves would surely follow. Britain, which had been driven to mighty achievements in the 7 Years' War by the elder Pitt, now found itself led by a ministry that represented no one. Public spirit had been crushed, personal interests prevailed over the common good. Even the threat of foreign war could not silence the turbulent bickering of political factions. Lord North's administration held its majority in the House of Commons only through patronage and the sufferance of those who should have known better. Insubordination showed itself in the fleet and in the army, especially among the officers. England had not known such wretched governance since the dark days of James II. The ministry was neither beloved nor respected. It stood for nothing, neither for the people nor for any branch of the aristocracy, neither for the spirit of the times, nor for the past age, nor for the age that was coming. It was a hodgepodge of inferior and mismatched elements, utterly unfit to govern a great and free empire. Yet this was an extraordinary period in British history. Philosophy flourished with Hume and Reid, with Price and Adam Smith. Reynolds mastered painting. Poetry and learning shone through Gray and Goldsmith, Johnson and Cowper. Legislative eloquence reached heights through Chatham, Burke, and Fox. History was being written by Gibbon, Hume, and Robertson. The useful arts advanced through Brindley, Watt, and Arkwright. That a nation in such a state of high and advancing culture should have been ruled by a ministry as sordid and mediocre as Lord North's cannot be explained by parliamentary corruption alone, for there was always an independent faction in the House of Commons. The full explanation requires understanding the chaotic state of political parties at that time. The conflict between England and her American colonies sprang necessarily from the development of British institutions themselves. The supreme right of Parliament, as representative of English nationality, bound to resist and overthrow the personal government of the Stuarts, had been the watchword of the Revolution of 1688. That revolution was dear to America as the death blow to monarchical absolutism throughout the English dominions and as the harbinger of constitutional liberty for the civilized world. Parliament again asserted its paramount authority over the Crown when by its own enactment it transferred the succession to the House of Hanover. These revolutions were achieved through a categorical principle that would endure no questioning of its rightfulness. Such a principle could not submit to modifications until it had accomplished its work. Embedded with the love of liberty in the mass of the English nation, it had moved and acted with the strength and majesty of a national conviction. Over the years, the assertion of Parliament's supreme power assumed an exaggerated form. It was claimed to extend without limit over Ireland and over the colonies. The very theory that had first been used to rescue and secure the liberties of England became an instrument of despotism. Both branches of Parliament represented only the same favored class. The kings awakened no counterbalancing sentiment of loyalty so long as the House of Hanover, Parliament's own creation, was represented by princes of foreign birth who were ignorant of the laws and language of the land.
For half a century, the government was conducted by an aristocracy that, keeping in memory the days of the Commonwealth and the days of James II, had convinced itself that the Constitution was safe only in its custody. The party of liberty, to use Rockingham's own words, was that which fought up against the king and against the people. But alongside the theory of absolute power concentrated in Parliament, which had twice been the sheet anchor of the English Constitution, there existed the older respect for the rights of the individual and the liberties of organized communities. These two elements of British political life were brought into collision by the American Revolution. The Revolution had its provocation in the theory of Parliament's omnipotence and its justification in the eyes of Englishmen in the principle of vital liberty diffused through all parts of the Commonwealth. The two ideas struggled for ascendancy in the mind of the British nation and in its legislature. Both are preserved in the undying eloquence of Burke, leading to the most opposite estimates of his political character. Both appear with startling distinctness in the speeches and conduct of Fox, who staked everything on the omnipotence of Parliament, yet excelled in the clear statement and defense of America's position. Both lay in irreconciled confusion in the politics of Rockingham, whose administration signalized itself by enacting the right of the King, Lords, and Commons of Britain to bind America in all cases whatsoever, yet in practice humanely refused to enforce that pretension. The aristocratic party of liberty, organized on the principle of Parliament's absolute power in order to defeat once and for all the designs of the king against parliamentary usages and rights, had done its work and outlived its usefulness. In opposition to the continued rule of an aristocracy wielding omnipotence over king and people, there rose around the venerable form of Chatham a new liberal party, willing to use the prerogative of the king to increase the weight of the Commons. This new party aimed at a double modification of Parliament's unrestricted sovereignty. The elder Pitt always insisted, and his friends continued to maintain, that the Commons of Great Britain had no right to impose taxes on unrepresented colonies. This was the first step in renovating English liberty. The next was to recognize that Parliament, as then composed, did not adequately represent the nation. Rockingham's connection resisted both these cardinal principles of reform. This unyielding division among the opponents of Lord North prolonged his administration. Many men of honest intentions, neither wishing to see English liberties impaired nor yet willing to consent to the independence of the colonies, kept their minds in a state of suspense. This reluctance to decide led them to bear a little longer the ministry that alone professed ability to suppress the insurrection. Better men would not consent to take their places if it meant continuing their policy. Once, in a moment of petulance, Lord George Germain resigned, and the king wished to be rid of him, but he was from necessity continued in his office because no one else could be found willing to accept it. In France, on the other side of the Channel, antagonistic forces were likewise in action. As representative of popular power, France had in reserve one great advantage over England in its numerous independent peasantry. Brought up in ignorance and seclusion, they knew not how to question anything taught by the Church or commanded by the monarch. However they might for the present suffer from grievous and unredressed oppression, they constituted the safeguard of order as well as of nationality. In the capital and among the cultivated classes of society, in coffee houses and salons, the cry rose for reform or revolution. The French king was absolute, yet the teachings of Montesquieu and the example of England raised in men of generous natures an uncontrollable desire for free institutions. Speculative fault-finders, knowing nothing of the self-restraint taught by responsibility in the exercise of office, indulged in ideal anticipations colored by an exasperating remembrance of griefs and wrongs. France was the eldest daughter of the Roman Church, with a king who was sincere though not bigoted in his Catholicism. Yet its philosophers carried their impassioned war against the Church to the utmost verge of skepticism and unbelief, while suspicion that forms of religion were used as mere instruments of government began to arise in the laboring classes of the cities. But apart from all inferior influences, the power of generalization, in which the French nation excels all others, imparts from time to time an idealistic character to its policy. The Parisians felt the reverses of the Americans as if they had been their own. In November 1776, an approaching rupture with England was the subject of all conversations.
The American struggle was avowedly a war in defense of the common rights of mankind. The Prince de Montbarret, who owed his place as Minister of War to the favor of Maurepas and female influence, and who cherished the prejudices of his order without being aware of his own mediocrity, professed to despise the people of the United States. He saw them as formed from emigrants for the most part without character and without fortune, ambitious and fanatical, and likely to attract to their support all the rogues and the worthless from the four parts of the globe. He had warned Lafayette against leaving his wife and wasting his fortune to play the part of Don Quixote in their behalf. He had raised in the council his feeble voice against the alliance of France with the insurgents. He regarded a victory over England as of no advantage commensurate with the dangerous example of sustaining a revolt against established authority. Besides, war would accumulate disorder in the public finances, retard useful works for the happiness of France, and justify reprisals by Great Britain on the colonies of the Bourbon princes. It was against the interior sentiment of the king and the doubts of Maurepas that the lingering influence of the policy of the balance of power, the mercantile aspirations of France, its spirit of philosophic freedom, and its traditional antagonism to England as the monopolist of commerce and ruler of the seas, forced the French alliance with America. Just 38 years before, Maurepas, in the vigor of manhood, had been famed for his aversion to England and for his desire to found his glory on the restoration of the French navy. Of the members of the administration of Cardinal Fleury, he was thought to have had the mind of the widest range. It was predicted of him that France would accomplish great results if he should ever become director of its government. At length, he was first minister of a king who looked up to him with deference and implicit trust. The tone of his thoughts was unchanged, but he was so enfeebled by long exclusion from public affairs and by years and infirmities that no heroic enterprise could lure him from the love of quiet. By habit, he put aside all business that admitted of delay. When the question of alliance with America became urgent, he shrank from proposing new taxes which the lately restored parliaments might refuse to register. He gladly accepted the guarantee of Necker that all war expenditures could be met by the use of credit, financial operations, and reforms. It was only after the assurance of sufficient money from loans that he no longer attempted to stem the opinion of Paris in favor of America. The strength of the cabinet lay in Vergennes. He secured the unfailing goodwill of his sovereign by recognizing no authority of either clergy, nobility, or third estate, but only of the monarch whom all three were to obey. Nor did he for a moment forget the respect due to Maurepas as his superior, so that he never excited jealousy of rivalry. He had no prejudice about calling republics into being, whether in Europe or beyond the Atlantic, if the welfare of France seemed to require it. He continued to believe that from the family alliance, Spain would follow France into war with England. In his eyes, the interests of that branch of the House of Bourbon took precedence over those of the United States. No head of an executive department was primarily a hearty friend to the new republic. Necker favored neutrality. Though he was Swiss by birth, his liberalism did not go beyond admiration of the British Constitution of that day. The statesmen of the nation had not yet deduced from experience and the intuitions of reason a system of civil liberty to supersede worn-out traditional forms. Just before the alliance between France and the United States, the lighter literature of the hour, skeptical rather than hopeful, mocked at the contradiction between institutions and rights. It asked if, while the mutinous Americans, without kings and without queens, bearded the whole world and were free, Europe should still be crushed by inexorable tyranny. Mirabeau wrote a fiery invective against despotism from a prison whose doors could not be opened even by his passionate prayer to leave to serve in America. Until chastened by affliction, Marie Antoinette wanted earnestness of character and suffered herself to be swayed by generous caprices, family ties, or the selfish solicitations of her female companions. She had ascendancy over the king and could not always conceal her contempt for his understanding, but never aspired to control his foreign policy, except in relation to Austria. It was only in the pursuit of benefits for her friends that she would suffer no denial. She did not spare words of petulance to a minister who dared to thwart her requests. Necker retained her favor by never refusing them. Her enthusiasm for the new republic was only superficial and occasional and could form no support for a steady conduct of the war.
The king felt for the Americans neither as insurgents against wrongs nor as a self-governing people. He never understood how it came about that, contrary to his own faith in monarchical power and in the Catholic Church, his kingdom had plunged into a war to introduce among the potentates of the civilized world a revolutionary Protestant republic. France was rich in resources, but its finances had not recovered from their exhaustion in the 7 Years' War. Their restoration became hopeless when Necker promised to employ the fame of his administration only to increase the public debt, which was already too heavy to be borne. The King of Prussia, whose poverty made him a sharp observer of the revenues of wealthier powers, repeatedly foretold the bankruptcy of France if its king should break the peace. All this while, Paris was the center of the gay society and intelligence of Europe. The best artists of the day and the masters of rival schools of music crowded around the court. The splendor of the Bourbon monarchy was kept up at the Tuileries and Versailles with prodigal magnificence. Invention was ever devising new refinements in social enjoyment. The queen was happy in the dazzling scenes of which she was the life. The king, a young man of 24, whom his Austrian brother-in-law described as a child, was pleased with the absolute power which he held it his right to exercise. To France, the years which followed are among the most glorious in her history, for they were those in which she prepared the way for the overthrow of feudalism and her own regeneration. But Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, when they embarked for the liberation of America with pleasure on the prow and the uncertain hand of youth at the helm, might have cried out to the new republic which they fostered, "Morituri te salutant," the doomed to die salute thee. The rescript of France, which announced to the British ministry her acknowledgement of American independence, assumed as a principle of public law that a nationality may, by its own declaration, speak itself into being. The old systems of the two governments were reversed. The British monarchy put forth its strength in behalf of unjust authority, while France became the foster mother of republicanism. In one respect, France was more suited than Britain to lead the peoples of Europe in the road to freedom. On the release of her rural population from serfdom, a large part of them retained their rights to the soil. Though bowed down under grievous burdens and evil laws, they had a home and acres from which they could not be evicted. In England and Scotland and Ireland, the property by feudal law was strictly in the tenant, but the feudal chiefs had taken to themselves in absolute ownership nearly all the ground. On the 4th of May, the treaties of commerce and alliance with Louis XVI were unanimously ratified by Congress, with grateful acknowledgments of his magnanimous and disinterested conduct, and the wish that the friendship so happily commenced between France and the United States might be perpetuated. The rivalries of centuries, in which the Americans had been involved only from their dependence on England, were effaced forever. Frenchmen became their friends, and the King of France was proclaimed the protector of the rights of mankind. Lafayette smiled as in Washington's camp he read that his government dated the independence of America from the moment of its own declaration. He said prophetically, "Therein lies a principle of national sovereignty which one day will be recalled to them at home." On the 6th, the alliance was celebrated at Valley Forge. After a salute of 13 cannon and a running fire of all the musketry, the army, drawn up in 2 lines, shouted, "Long live the King of France," and again, "Long live the friendly European powers." The ceremonies were closed by a huzzah for the American states. In an address to the inhabitants of the United States, Congress assumed that independence was secured, and they proclaimed the existence of a new people, though they could not hide its want of a government. They rightly represented its territory as a continental one, most blessed in its climate and productions. They owned its financial embarrassments because no taxes had been laid to carry on the war. They invited their countrymen to bring forth their armies into the field, while men of leisure were encouraged to collect money for the public funds. In return for all losses, they promised the sweets of free commerce with every part of the earth.
On the 18th of May, a festival was given to General Howe by 30 of his officers, most of them members of his staff. The numerous company embarked on the Delaware above the town, and to the music of 108 hautboys rowed 2 miles down the stream in galleys and boats, glittering with colors and streamers. They passed 200 transport vessels, tricked out in bravery and crowded with onlookers. Landing to the tune of "God Save the King" under salutes from 2 decorated ships of war, they marched between lines of cavalry and infantry and all the standards of the army to a lawn. There, in the presence of their chosen ladies raised on thrones, officers fantastically dressed as knights and squires engaged in a tournament. After this, they proceeded under an ornamented arch to a splendidly furnished house where dancing began and a gaming table was opened with a bank of 2,000 guineas. The tickets of admission described the guest of the night as the sun going down in brightness to rise in greater glory. Fireworks in dazzling letters promised him immortal laurels. At midnight, a supper of 430 covers was served under the light of 1,200 wax candles and was enlivened by an orchestra of more than 100 instruments. Dancing continued till the sun was more than an hour high. Never had subordinates given a more brilliant farewell to a departing general. It was doubly dear to their commander, for it expressed their belief that the ministry had wronged him and that his merit pointed him out for advancement. Meantime, Lord Howe and Sir Henry Clinton, each acting under special instructions, separately communicated the 3 conciliatory acts of Parliament to Congress, who received them on the 6th of June, and on the same day answered, "They have in April last expressed their sentiments on bills not essentially different. When the King of Great Britain shall be seriously disposed to end the unprovoked war waged against these United States, they will readily attend to such terms of peace as may consist with the honor of independent nations and the sacred regard they mean to pay to treaties." On the day of this second rejection of Lord North's offers, the 3 British commissioners arrived in Philadelphia. In sailing up the Delaware, they had seen enough to regret 10,000 times that their rulers, instead of a tour through the worn-out countries of Europe, had not finished their education with a visit round the coasts and rivers of this beautiful and boundless continent. The English rivers shrank for them into rills. They predicted that in a few years Philadelphia would become a magnificent metropolis. Their mission was a mere device to aid Lord North in governing the House of Commons and to reconcile the people of England to a continuance of the war.
Carlyle, the first commissioner, had in the House of Lords spoken with warmth on the insolence of the rebels in refusing to treat with the Howes, and stigmatized them as base and unnatural children of England. The second commissioner was an undersecretary whose chief in the same assembly had scoffed at Congress as a body of vagrants. The third was Johnston, who lately in Parliament had justified the Americans and charged the king with hypocrisy.
In the certainty that the commission would not be received, Clinton was instructed to abandon Philadelphia, to hold New York and Rhode Island, to curtail the boundaries of the 13 states on the northeast and on the south, to lay waste Virginia by means of ships of war, and to attack Providence, Boston, and all accessible ports between New York and Nova Scotia, destroying vessels, wharfs, stores, and materials for shipbuilding. The Indians from Detroit to Florida were to be hounded on to spread dismay and death all along the frontiers. No active operations at the north were expected. The king, under his sign manual, ordered Clinton to detach 5,000 men for the conquest of the French island, St. Lucia. As the commissioners stepped on shore, they found to their extreme surprise and chagrin that orders for the immediate evacuation of Philadelphia had preceded them. If Philadelphia is left to the rebels, it was said, independence is acknowledged and America lost. About 3,000 of the inhabitants were embarking in British ships. Those who resolved to stay roused from a delusive confidence in British protection to restless anxiety. In this strait, the representatives of Britain, in a communication to Congress sealed with the image of a fond mother caressing her children, recognized the constituency of Congress as states and pressed them to accept perfect freedom of legislation and of internal government, representation in Parliament, and an exemption from the presence of military forces except with their own permission. In short, the gratification of every wish that America had expressed. And they insinuated that France was the common enemy. These offers were made without authority and were therefore fraudulent. Before an answer could be received, they had sailed down the Delaware. Congress resented the letter of the commissioners as an offense to their own honor and to their ally. Their wars with France had been but a consequence of their connection with England. Independence was peace. By a unanimous vote, they on the 17th made answer as before. The idea of dependence is inadmissible. Congress will be ready to enter upon a treaty of peace and commerce when the King of Great Britain shall demonstrate a sincere disposition for that purpose by an explicit acknowledgment of the independence of these states or withdrawing his fleets and armies. The American officers were of the same mind, except Lee, who was false, and Gates, who, in the belief that everything contended for was granted, wished a conference with the commissioners. To Johnston, Washington wrote, "The voice of Congress is the voice of the people." The Convention of Saratoga had been broken by the British at the time of the surrender by the concealment of public property. In November 1777, Burgoyne had made a formal but groundless complaint of its violation by the Americans and raised the implication that the pretended breach might be used to disengage himself and his government from all the obligations which it imposed. Moreover, Congress had made a demand for lists of all persons comprehended in the surrender, and a compliance with this proper and even necessary requisition had been refused. In January 1778, Congress suspended the embarkation of the army until the convention should be confirmed by the highest authority of Great Britain. Refusing the intervention of the British commissioners from their want of power, Congress on the 4th of September, without a dissentient voice, confirmed their resolution. On the night following the 17th of June, Sir Henry Clinton crossed the Delaware with more than 17,000 effective men. The Loyalists saw in the retreat a violation of the plighted faith of the British king. The winter's revelry was over. Honors and offices turned suddenly to bitterness and ashes. Papers of protection became only an opprobrium and a peril. Crowds of wretched refugees with all of their possessions which they could transport fled with the army.
The sky sparkled with stars. The air of the summer night was soft and tranquil as the exiles, broken in fortune and without a career, went in despair from the only city they could love.
When Washington encountered the fugitives, he, in a voice of just anger, demanded of Lee, "What is the meaning of this?" Abashed and confused, Lee stammered, "Sir, sir." To the renewed inquiry, he answered, "You know that the attack was contrary to my advice and opinion." Washington rejoined, "You should not have undertaken the command unless you intended to carry it through," and at once arrested the retreat. As the narrow road through which the best troops of the British Army, led by Clinton and Cornwallis and numbering from 6,000 to 8,000, were now hotly chasing an unresisting enemy, was bounded on each side by a morass, he swiftly formed two of the retreating regiments of Wayne's brigade, commanded by Stuart and Ramsay, in front of the pursuers and under their fire. Thus he gained time to plant the troops that were advancing with him upon good ground. This being done, he again met Lee, who was doing nothing like one in a private capacity. Finding in him no disposition to retrieve his character, Washington ordered him to the rear. Even Lawrence hoped for no more than an orderly retreat. Hamilton's thought was to die on the spot. But Washington's self-possession, his inspiring mien, his exposure of himself to every danger, and the obvious wisdom of his orders kindled the enthusiasm of officers and men. Lee, in the rear, sitting idly on horseback, explained to bystanders that the attempt was madness and could not be successful. The British cavalry were easily driven back and showed themselves no more. The regiments of foot came up next, but they could not turn the left flank, where Sterling commanded, without exposing their own right to the American artillery. The attack upon the right, where Greene commanded, was defeated by his battery. Others encountered the grenadiers and guards till they turned and fled. When they rallied and came back to the charge, Wayne, with a body of infantry, engaged them face to face till they were again repulsed, Lieutenant Colonel Monckton falling at their head. During the day, the heat reached 96 degrees in the shade. Many on both sides, struck by the sun, fell dead without a wound. The British retired through the pass by which they had advanced and occupied a position accessible in front only by the narrow road and protected on both flanks by woods and morasses which could not be turned before night. Two American brigades hung on their right, a third on their left, while the rest of the army planted their standards on the field of battle and lay on their arms to renew the contest at daybreak. But Clinton, abandoning his severely wounded and leaving his dead unburied, before midnight withdrew his forces, which at the early dawn found shelter in the highlands of Middleburg. Washington then marched toward the North River. The British made for New York by way of Sandy Hook. On receiving the English accounts, Frederick of Prussia replied, "Clinton gained no advantage except to reach New York with the wreck of his army. America is probably lost for England." Of the Americans who were in the engagement, 229 were killed or wounded. Of the British, more than 400 and above 800 deserted their standard during the march through the Jerseys.
In the battle, which took its name from the adjacent village of Monmouth, the American generals, except Lee, did well. Wayne especially established his fame. The army and the whole country resounded with the praises of Washington, and Congress unanimously thanked him for his great good conduct and victory. Nor may history omit to record that of the revolutionary patriots who on that day periled life for their country, more than 700 colored Americans fought side by side with the white. After the battle, Lee was treated from headquarters with forbearance, but in two letters to the commander-in-chief, he avowed the expectation that the campaign would close the war. That is, that the terms offered by the British commissioners would be accepted, and he demanded reparation for injustice and injury. A court-martial found him guilty of disobedience, misbehavior before the enemy, and disrespect to the commander-in-chief. All too leniently, it did but suspend him from command for 12 months. After long delay, Congress confirmed the sentence, though by a narrow vote. The next year, it censured Lee for obtaining money through British officers in New York. In January 1780, provoked by an impertinent letter, Congress dismissed him from the service. From that time, he no longer concealed his wish for the return of America to her old allegiance, and his chosen companions were the partisans of England. Under the false colors of military genius and experience in war, he had solicited a command. After his appointment, he had given the reins to self-will so that misfortune overtook his treachery. In October 1782, sinking under a fever in a sordid inn at Philadelphia, he died as he had lived, loving neither God nor man. This was the moment when everything hung in the balance. The alliance with France had been secured, but the British still held major cities. The American army had survived Valley Forge, but it remained to be seen whether it could stand against the best troops Britain could throw against it. At Monmouth, Washington proved that American soldiers, properly led, could face down the finest regiments of the British Empire and send them retreating into the night. The war was far from over, but after Monmouth, after the alliance with France was ratified and celebrated, after the British abandoned Philadelphia in disgrace, the momentum had shifted. The dream of independence, which had seemed so impossible just months before at Valley Forge, now appeared not just possible, but inevitable. The alliance of France with the United States had awakened in the heart of Europe the hope of overthrowing the old colonial system. American independence would be won not by arms alone, but by the sympathies of neutral princes and nations who saw in this struggle something greater than a mere colonial rebellion. They saw the birth of a new idea, that free men could govern themselves, that republics could stand alongside monarchies, that the rights of mankind were not granted by kings, but inherent in human nature itself. The world was watching, and at Monmouth, America had shown the world that it would not bow, would not break, would not surrender its claim to liberty and self-government. The sun that set on the battlefield that sweltering June day in 1778 set on a different world than the one that had risen that morning. The old order was passing away. A new order was being born in blood and sacrifice and unwavering determination. And nothing, not the might of the British Empire, not the treachery of men like Charles Lee, not the doubts and divisions that plagued both sides of the Atlantic, could stop it now. If this story of courage, alliance, and the birth of a nation moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. There are many more untold stories from the American Revolution waiting to be discovered, and your support helps us bring them to light.